The strange call for help. John stared at the blinking screen in his tiny mechanic shop on the edge of Mars Colony 12. The shop was quiet, except for the faint hum of machines in the background. It was supposed to be just another dull evening. He was used to fixing broken drills and patching up mining bots. But tonight was different. The signal came out of nowhere. At first, John thought it was just static. A faint crackling sound buzzed through his old comm device. He almost ignored it, but then he heard something that made his heart skip a beat. A voice. Soft, shaky, and desperate. "Please, anyone, help us." John froze, leaning closer to the speaker. The voice didn't sound human. There was a strange echo to it, like a song sung underwater, but it wasn't threatening. It was scared, and it was asking for help. John's instincts screamed at him to turn off the signal and forget he ever heard it. The last time someone in the colony responded to an alien signal, it ended in disaster. People still whispered about the raids, the bloodshed, and the heavy cost of trusting outsiders. Helping aliens was against every law and every bit of common sense, but something about the voice wouldn't let him walk away. Who is this?" John asked, his voice cautious. There was silence for a moment, and then the voice returned, trembling. "My name. It's Kaleri. My family. We are in danger. Please, help us." John's chest tightened. Family. Danger. The words hit him harder than he expected. Memories of his own past flashed through his mind. His wife, his child, the family he'd lost years ago during a mining accident. He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. This wasn't his problem. He didn't even know if this was real. "How do I know this isn't a trick?" he asked, his tone sharp. There was another pause, followed by a softer reply. "I have children. They are dying. Please, I have no one else to ask." John clenched his fists. He didn't want to care, but something about the voice, the raw pain in it, stirred something deep inside him. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his jacket and a flashlight. He had to know. The Martian night was cold and unforgiving. John followed the signal's coordinates through the rocky wasteland, his boots crunching against the red sand. The wind howled around him, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Every step felt heavier than the last. "This is stupid," he muttered to himself. "I'm probably walking into a trap." But he kept going. The signal grew stronger, and the voice became clearer. It guided him to a narrow canyon hidden in the shadows. His flashlight flickered as he stepped closer, scanning the area for any signs of life. And then he saw it. A small battered ship lay half buried in the sand. Its metal frame was scorched and torn, as if it had barely survived a crash. The sight sent a chill down John's spine. He wasn't sure what he expected, but this wasn't it. As he approached, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, slender, and cloaked in tattered fabric that shimmered faintly under the flashlight's beam. The face beneath the hood wasn't human. Large, luminous eyes stared at him with a mix of fear and hope. "Kaleri?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure nodded, pulling back the hood to reveal pale, glowing skin and delicate features. She was unlike anything John had ever seen. Behind her, two small figures clung to her legs, their tiny frames wrapped in what looked like silver blankets. They didn't move, except for their faint, shallow breaths. "You're human," Kaleri said, her voice soft but filled with relief. "You came." John didn't know what to say. His eyes darted between her and the children. They looked so fragile, so helpless. He took a cautious step forward. "What happened to you?" he asked. Kaleri hesitated, glancing back at the ship. "We were attacked. My mate, he didn't make it. Now it's just us. My children are sick. They need shelter, warmth. Please, help us." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. This was no trick, no trap, just a mother trying to save her kids. John felt his resolve waver. He knew what the right thing to do was, but it wasn't that simple. Helping her could mean risking everything: his safety, his shop, his life. "I don't even know you," he said, his voice cracking. "Why should I trust you?" Kalari's eyes filled with tears, and she lowered her head. "You have no reason to trust me. But if you leave us here, we will die." The words hung in the cold air, heavy and unshakable. John swallowed hard. He wanted to walk away. He really did. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He couldn't turn his back on them, not after everything he'd heard. With a deep breath, he reached out his hand. "All right, come with me. But if this goes wrong, I'll regret it." Kalari nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. She lifted one child in her arms, and John helped her carry the other. Together, they disappeared into the night, leaving the wrecked ship and its secrets behind. As they walked back to the colony, John couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. Meeting the alien mother, John guided Kalari and her children through the winding tunnels beneath his workshop. The tunnels were old, carved decades ago by miners who thought there would be hidden water beneath the Martian surface. They found nothing but red dust and disappointment. Now, the tunnel served as storage for John's forgotten projects: half-built machines, rusting tools, and crates of spare parts. As they stepped inside, the dim lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Kalari's eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting the lights like twin stars. Her children clung tightly to her, their small hands gripping the fabric of her cloak. They didn't speak, but John felt their wide eyes watching his every move. "Not much," John said, motioning to the corner with a cot and a small heater. "But it's warm. You'll be safe down here." Kalari lowered herself onto the cot carefully, as if afraid it might break beneath her. She tucked the children close, wrapping them in the silver blankets. John noticed the blankets shimmered faintly when Kalari touched them, like they were woven with energy he couldn't see. "Thank you," Kalari whispered, her voice soft but filled with exhaustion. John stood awkwardly by the door, scratching the back of his neck. He wasn't used to guests, especially not alien ones. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered. "I'm risking a lot by letting you stay here." Kalari nodded slowly, lowering her gaze. "I understand. I will not ask for more than you can give." John sighed, sitting down on an overturned crate. His eyes drifted to the children. They were pale, too pale, with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. They huddled close to their mother, but their breaths were shallow, and their limbs barely moved. "What's wrong with them?" John asked quietly. Kalari's expression tightened. She ran her fingers gently over the children's foreheads, humming softly. "They are connected to me," she explained. "My people do not survive long without the bond of family. It keeps us strong. But since we lost their father, they have grown weak." John frowned. "They need medicine." Kalari shook her head. "No human medicine will help. It is not illness. It is the heart. If the bond fades, they fade with it." John leaned back, staring at the ceiling. This was far beyond anything he could handle. "I'm just a mechanic," he muttered. "I fix machines, not people." Kalari looked at him carefully, her eyes filled with something John couldn't quite place. Hope, maybe, or something deeper. "You have already done more than most," she said. "You listened. That is the first step." John didn't know how to respond to that. Instead, he stood up and walked to the small heater by the wall. He knelt down, adjusting the settings to increase the warmth. The old machine groaned in protest but obeyed. The room filled with a gentle hum, and the chill in the air began to fade. Kalari watched him closely. "You are kind," she said softly. John chuckled dryly. "I wouldn't say that. I'm just not heartless." For the first time, Kalari smiled. A small, brief smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it came. But John noticed. Hours passed. John worked quietly in the corner, tinkering with an old mining bot that hadn't run in years. He told himself he was just keeping busy, but his eyes kept drifting to Kalari and the children. At some point, Kalari began humming softly, a strange melodic tune that didn't sound like any song John had ever heard. The children slowly began to relax, their breathing evening out. John leaned closer. "What's that?" he asked. "A lullaby," Kalari replied without opening her eyes. "It helped strengthen the bond. In our culture, songs carry love from parent to child." John nodded thoughtfully. "We have something like that too." Kalari opened her eyes, looking at him curiously. "You sing to your young?" John hesitated. "I used to." Kalari didn't press further, but John could feel her understanding in the silence that followed. Later that night, as John prepared to leave them to rest, Kalari spoke up again. "John." He paused at the doorway. "I know this is dangerous for you," she said, her voice low. "But I believe there is a reason you found us." John glanced back at her. "I don't believe in fate." Kalari smiled faintly. "Neither do I. But I believe in the kindness of strangers, and I believe you are more important to this story than you realize." John didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and stepped out, leaving the alien mother and her children in the quiet warmth of the hidden room. As he climbed the ladder back into his workshop, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had already started to change, whether he was ready for it or not. The hidden truth. John sat in his workshop, pretending to focus on the mining drone that lay dismantled on his workbench. His hands moved automatically, twisting bolts and rewiring circuits, but his mind wasn't on the job. It had been 3 days since he brought Kalari and her children into the tunnels beneath his shop. 3 days of quiet footsteps and whispered songs drifting up through the floorboards at night. John told himself he was just being cautious. He kept a close eye on them because aliens were unpredictable. That's all it was. Nothing more. But deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't stop worrying about them. The colony had been tense lately. Rumors of mercenaries landing nearby spread like wildfire. Everyone knew the bounty hunters came for one reason: aliens. And John knew Kalari was exactly the kind of target they were looking for. John's thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of footsteps coming up the tunnel ladder. He turned just in time to see Kalari stepping carefully into the workshop. She carried a small bundle of tools he had left behind in the tunnels. "You didn't have to bring those up," John said, setting down his wrench. Kalari smiled softly. "I thought you might need them." She crossed the room, placing the tools on the workbench. John couldn't help but notice how quietly she moved, almost like she belonged in the shadows. Her presence didn't disturb the air, yet something about her made the room feel warmer. "How are the kids?" John asked, glancing toward the tunnel entrance. Kalari's smile faded. "Better, but not well. They are still weak." John leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I thought you said they weren't sick." "They aren't," Kalari said softly, her eyes meeting his. "It's the bond, John. Without it, they grow weaker every day." John frowned. "I don't understand. What kind of bond are we talking about here?" Kalari hesitated, as if searching for the right words. Finally, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. "My people, we are not like humans. We survive by connection, by love. A parent's love keeps their children strong. When my mate died, part of that bond died with him. Now, I carry it alone, but I am not enough." John stared at her, trying to make sense of it. "So, you're saying they need more love?" Kalari nodded. "It is not something I can explain easily, but the bond doesn't have to come from our own kind. Sometimes it can come from others." John's eyes narrowed. "You mean humans?" "Yes." He shook his head, leaning back in his chair. "I'm not sure I'm the right guy for that. I'm not exactly father material." Kalari stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You already care, John. I can see it. They can too." John scoffed. Caring and bonding with alien kids are two different things. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of machinery in the background. Finally, Callery knelt beside the workbench, lowering herself until she was at eye level with John. Her luminous eyes softened, almost pleading. "Let me show you," she said. John shifted uncomfortably. "Show me what?" Callery gently reached out, her hand hovering near his. "I can share the bond, just for a moment. You will feel what they feel. It may help you understand." John hesitated. Every rational part of his brain told him to say no, but something in Callery's voice made it impossible to refuse. Slowly, he extended his hand. The moment her fingertips brushed his skin, John's entire body stiffened. Suddenly, he wasn't in the workshop anymore. He saw flashes, memories that weren't his. A vast, glowing forest beneath a violet sky. Children laughing, chasing each other through tall grass. A warm presence like sunlight wrapping around him, filling him with comfort and safety. And then, darkness. A terrible emptiness, cold and suffocating. He felt Callery's pain, the loss of her mate, the desperate struggle to keep her children alive. John gasped, pulling his hand away. The workshop snapped back into focus. His heart pounded in his chest, sweat beading on his forehead. Callery watched him silently, waiting for him to speak. John rubbed his face, trying to shake the feeling. "That was intense." Callery nodded. "Now you understand. It is not just survival, John. It is life. Without it, they will fade." John swallowed hard, staring down at his hands. "What exactly do you need from me?" "Just stay close," Callery said softly. "You don't need to become their father. Your presence alone may help." John let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair. He didn't sign up for this. He was just a mechanic, trying to make it through another Martian winter. But as he glanced toward the tunnel, where Callery's children slept, he knew he couldn't turn his back on them. "All right," he said finally. "I'll stay close. But if things get dangerous..." Callery smiled, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "I know. And for now, this is enough." John didn't know what he was getting himself into. But deep down, he felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Threats on the horizon. John's grip tightened around the handle of his mug as he stared out the narrow window of his workshop. The Martian sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the red dunes outside. For 3 weeks, Callery and her children had lived in the tunnels beneath his shop. In that time, John had grown used to their quiet presence. The kids had even started venturing out into the workshop late at night, watching him work from the corners of the room. They didn't speak much, not in words, at least, but sometimes John swore he could feel their emotions, a flicker of curiosity, a faint sense of warmth. It was strange, but he didn't mind. Until the mercenaries arrived. It started with rumors. Colony workers whispered about off-worlders asking questions at the spaceport. People who didn't belong, lingering too long near the outer edges of the colony. John tried to ignore it. He told himself they were probably just scavengers looking for parts, but then he saw them for himself. 3 men, dressed in black, moving with the precision of soldiers. They didn't wear colony uniforms. Their faces were hard, sharp, the kind of men who had seen too many battles and left too much blood behind them. They didn't come to John's shop at first, but they were getting closer. And John knew exactly who they were hunting. John. Callery's soft voice pulled him out of his thoughts. He turned to see her standing at the base of the ladder, half hidden in the shadows. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked quietly. John set his mug down, sighing heavily. "Yeah, a few of them. Asking questions." Callery's eyes dimmed slightly, her face unreadable. She glanced toward the tunnel, where her children were still sleeping. "I can take them and leave," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "I don't want to bring danger to you." John shook his head. "They'll just keep coming. If they find you out there, you'll have no chance." Callery hesitated, stepping closer. I don't want you hurt because of us. John met her gaze. I'm already in this. Might as well see it through. Hilary studied him for a long moment, as if searching for something. Finally, she nodded. Thank you. But John wasn't sure gratitude would be enough to keep them safe. Later that evening, John locked up the shop, shutting down the lights as the colony streets grew quiet. He stepped outside, glancing up at the sky. The stars shimmered faintly above, but something about the night felt different. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. As he turned to head back inside, a voice stopped him. Nice shop you've got here. John's heart sank. He turned slowly, finding one of the mercenaries standing near the edge of the lot. The man leaned casually against a metal post, but his eyes were cold and calculating. Didn't catch your name, the mercenary continued. John, he replied flatly. The mercenary smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. People say you keep to yourself out here, work long hours. But lately, they've noticed you've had company. John's hand twitched, resisting the urge to reach for the wrench in his pocket. I run a shop. People come and go. The mercenary chuckled. Sure, but I'm not talking about people. I'm talking about things that aren't supposed to be here. John forced his face to remain blank. Haven't seen anything like that. The mercenary stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. You sure about that? John met his gaze without flinching. I'm sure. For a long moment, they stood there, locked in silence. Finally, the mercenary shrugged. Well, if you do happen to see anything, let us know, he said, turning away. Wouldn't want anyone to get hurt over a misunderstanding. John didn't respond. He watched the mercenary disappear into the shadows before stepping back inside and locking the door behind him. Hilary was waiting near the workbench, her eyes narrowed. They're getting closer, she said quietly. John nodded. We need to be ready. Hilary placed a hand gently on his arm. I will protect them, John, no matter what happens. John glanced at the tunnel, where the children's soft breathing echoed faintly. We protect them, he corrected. Hilary smiled softly, but there was a flicker of worry in her gaze. The mercenaries weren't going to stop, and John had the sinking feeling that the next time they came, they wouldn't be asking questions. The chase the knock came just before dawn. John was already awake, sitting in the corner of his workshop with a half-empty cup of coffee cooling beside him. He had barely slept, the tension winding tighter in his chest with every hour that passed. The mercenaries were getting bolder. Yesterday they had circled his shop twice. One of them lingered near the entrance longer than usual, his sharp gaze scanning the perimeter as if he could smell the secret hidden beneath John's feet. Now, they were back. John set the cup down quietly, stepping toward the door. He didn't open it immediately. John, the voice called from outside. Calm, patient, but laced with something darker. We know you're in there. John's fingers twitched near the latch. He glanced down at the floorboards, knowing Hilary and the children were somewhere below, hidden in the tunnels. He took a slow breath. Think, John. Stay calm. You always knock this early, or am I just special? He said, keeping his voice steady as he unlocked the door and pulled it open. 3 mercenaries stood outside, their faces partially hidden beneath worn helmets. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, smiled faintly. Lucky day for you, the leader said, stepping closer. We just need to take a look around. Colony security measures and all that. John leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Funny. I don't remember the colony electing mercenaries to run security. The scared man chuckled. It's less official. More volunteer work. John's eyes narrowed. I'm not interested in volunteers. Now, if you don't mind. The mercenary's foot stopped the door before it could close. I do mind, he said flatly. His eyes drifted over John's shoulder, scanning the dim workshop behind him. Word is, you've been keeping things from us. John's grip tightened on the door. I don't know who's been talking, but I'm not hiding anything. The mercenary's eyes lingered on the floor for just a second too long. John's heart sank. In the tunnels below, Kaleri held her children close. The faint hum of the workshop overhead vibrated softly against the walls, but she could feel the tension rising. Her children clung to her cloak, their luminous eyes wide with fear. Kaleri could sense John's growing anxiety, the flicker of unease brushing against her mind like ripples in still water. She didn't need to hear the conversation to know the danger was inches away. "They're here," whispered her eldest child, his voice trembling. Kaleri pressed a hand against his chest, calming his racing heart. "Stay quiet," she said softly. "We trust John." But even as she said the words, doubt flickered through her thoughts. Could John truly protect them? Up above, the situation was unraveling quickly. John stepped forward, forcing the door open wider and blocking the mercenary's path. "I told you, there's nothing to see here," he said, his voice harder now. Scarface's smile faded. "Funny thing, John. People always say that right before we find something worth seeing." John stared him down, refusing to move. And then, behind them, a soft noise echoed from beneath the floor. It was faint, barely noticeable. But the mercenary heard it. Scarface's head tilted slightly, his eyes narrowing. Without a word, he stepped inside, brushing past John like he owned the place. His men followed closely, spreading out through the workshop. John's pulse pounded in his ears. "You idiot. You got rats under there, John?" Scarface asked casually as he stepped toward the far side of the room, boots thudding against the floor. John's mind raced. Just old pipes shifting. This place wasn't built to last. Scarface didn't respond. His gaze locked onto a metal grate in the floor, the hidden entrance to the tunnels. John saw it happen in slow motion. The mercenary reached down, his fingers curling around the edges of the grate. John moved before he could think. With one swift motion, John grabbed the closest tool, a heavy wrench, and swung it toward Scarface's hand. The metal clanged loudly, knocking the man's hand away. Scarface stumbled back, snarling in surprise. John pointed the wrench at him, his jaw tight. "I told you, you're not welcome here." For a brief second, the workshop was deathly silent. Scarface's eyes narrowed, cold fury simmering beneath the surface. Then he smiled again, but there was no humor in it. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. John didn't flinch. "Maybe, but you shouldn't have come here." Scarface stepped back, motioning to his men. "Let's go," he said, but his gaze lingered on John like a warning. "We'll be back." As the mercenaries disappeared into the early morning fog, John locked the door behind them, exhaling shakily. Moments later, Kaleri emerged from the tunnel, her children following closely. "They heard us," she said, her voice tight with worry. John nodded grimly. "Yeah, and they're not letting this go." Kaleri's eyes softened with gratitude, but fear still lingered beneath the surface. "You didn't have to stop them." John met her gaze. "Yes, I did." He glanced down at the children, who clung to Kaleri's legs. "We're not running anymore," John said firmly. "Next time, we stand our ground." The bond deepens. The workshop was quiet after the mercenaries left, but the tension lingered like a thick fog that refused to lift. John sat at his workbench, staring at the half-assembled mining drone in front of him. His hands were still, but his mind raced. Kaleri sat nearby, gently cradling her youngest child in her lap. Her other child sat cross-legged on the floor, quietly fiddling with a small mechanical part John had given him earlier. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, not exactly, but there was a weight to it. "They'll be back," John said at last, breaking the stillness. Kaleri nodded, stroking her child's hair absent-mindedly. "I know," John sighed, rubbing his face. "I've got a feeling they won't knock next time." Kaleri's glowing eyes met his. "Then we prepare." John looked over at her, surprised by how calm she seemed. "You're taking this better than I expected." Kaleri smiled faintly. Fear does not help my children. If I let it take hold, it weakens the bond even more. John glanced at the two small figures beside her. He had noticed the difference. The children seemed brighter, less fragile than when they first arrived. How is that possible? John asked, his voice low. They were barely breathing when I found you. Now they're stronger, Kaleri finished for him. Yes, they are healing because of you. John frowned, shaking his head. I haven't done anything. Kaleri set her child down gently and rose to her feet. She crossed the room, standing just a few feet from John's workbench. You don't realize it, John, but you have, she said softly. You've let us stay. You've watched over us. Even now, you're risking your life to keep us hidden. John shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Yeah, well, it's not like I had much of a choice. Kaleri's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. Perhaps, but the bond doesn't form from duty alone. It grows from something deeper. John opened his mouth to argue, but before he could speak, the child sitting on the floor tugged at his sleeve. John looked down. The child held up the small mechanical part he had been playing with, a broken sensor from one of John's old projects. The wires had been twisted into a strange, intricate pattern that John didn't recognize. John took the part carefully, turning it over in his hands. Where did you learn to do this? The child's eyes shimmered, but he didn't speak. Instead, Kaleri stepped forward. Our children learn quickly, she said. They understand the emotions of those around them. When they feel safe, they grow. When they feel loved, they thrive. John set the part down, leaning back in his chair. I'm not sure I'm the best role model. Kaleri knelt beside him, placing her hand gently over his. Her touch was warm, and for a moment, John felt something stir deep within him, a strange, quiet sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. You care more than you think, she whispered. That is enough. John looked away, focusing on the cluttered workbench instead. Maybe, he muttered. Over the next few days, John found himself spending more time with Kaleri and the children. The youngest one, who Kaleri called Lyra, had grown attached to John, following him around the workshop and watching him work. She didn't speak much, but her eyes sparkled with curiosity every time he fixed something. One afternoon, John handed her a small spanner, guiding her hands carefully as they tightened a loose bolt on one of the mining drones. You're a natural, John said, grinning despite himself. Lyra smiled shyly, hugging the spanner close like it was a prized possession. Kaleri watched from a distance, her gaze soft but unreadable. Later that evening, as the children slept, John sat across from Kaleri at the workbench. You were right, he admitted quietly, about the bond. Kaleri tilted her head, her expression curious. I didn't expect to feel this connected, John continued, but it's like they're starting to trust me. And he hesitated. I think I trust them too. Kaleri's smile was warm, but there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. They see you as family now, she said. John shifted uncomfortably. I'm not sure I deserve that. Kaleri's hand brushed against his, the brief touch sending a strange warmth through his chest. Family isn't about deserving, she said gently. It's about choosing each other. John didn't reply. But as he looked toward the sleeping children, he realized she was right. For the first time in years, his workshop didn't feel empty. And despite the danger lurking just beyond the colony walls, John felt something else stirring within him. Hope. The final stand. The mercenaries came at dawn. John woke to the sound of distant footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and far too many. He was already pulling on his boots by the time Kaleri appeared at the tunnel entrance, her face pale but calm. They're here, she said quietly. John nodded grimly, fastening his tool belt. I know. Through the narrow window, he could see dark shapes moving across the red dunes. Scarface was leading them, his rifle slung across his back as he approached with the slow confidence of a man who thought the fight was already won. John didn't wait for them to knock this time. He turned to Kalari and her children, who huddled near the tunnel entrance. "Take the kids. Get as deep into the tunnels as you can," he said, his voice firm but calm. Kalari hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. "John." "I'll hold them off," he interrupted. "Just stay hidden." Kalari placed a hand on his arm. "We can face them together." John shook his head. "No. If they see you, they won't stop. This isn't just about survival. It's about sending a message. I need them to think you're gone." Kalari's gaze held his for a long moment before she finally nodded. She knelt by the children, speaking softly in her own language. The kids obeyed without question, disappearing into the shadows of the tunnel. As Kalari turned to follow them, she paused. "John." He glanced back. "No matter what happens," she said softly, "you are part of our family now." John swallowed hard, forcing a small nod. "I'll see you on the other side." By the time Scarface reached the front of the workshop, John was waiting. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, blocking the entrance like he had nothing to lose. Scarface slowed to a stop a few feet away, his men fanning out behind him. "Morning, John," Scarface said, offering a cold smile. "We were just passing through." John's eyes flicked to the rifles slung across their backs. "Looks like a lot of firepower for a friendly visit." Scarface chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "We like to be prepared." John leaned against the doorframe, casually tapping the handle of the wrench on his belt. "Well, you can turn around. There's nothing here for you." Scarface's eyes narrowed. "Is that so?" John didn't flinch. "I told you before. No aliens here. Just me and a pile of scrap." Scarface stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. His gaze drifted past John, scanning the interior of the workshop. "Funny thing, John," Scarface said slowly. "You've been real protective of this place lately, almost like you've got something to hide." John tightened his grip on the wrench. "I'm just not a fan of uninvited guests." Scarface's smile faded. "You're not making this easy." "I'm not trying to." Scarface's hand drifted toward his rifle. "Step aside." John didn't move. For a long moment, they stared each other down. The air between them felt electric, the weight of unspoken threats pressing down like a storm about to break. And then Scarface gave a small nod. "Search the place," he ordered. The mercenaries spread out, tearing through the workshop with ruthless efficiency. They overturned crates, pulled apart machinery, and scanned every dark corner. John stayed near the entrance, watching silently as they worked. He knew they wouldn't find the tunnel entrance. He had sealed it beneath a pile of scrap the night before, burying it under layers of old mining equipment. But he also knew Scarface wasn't the type to leave empty-handed. Sure enough, after nearly half an hour, Scarface approached John again. "Nothing here," one of his men reported. Scarface's gaze lingered on John, cold and calculating. "You know what I think, John," Scarface said quietly. "I think you're lying." John met his stare without blinking. "I think you've wasted enough of my time." Scarface studied him for a long moment before finally stepping back. "We'll be watching," he said, his voice low. "If we find out you've been hiding them, there won't be a next time." John didn't respond. He waited until they were gone, until the dust of their departure had settled over the red dunes, before finally locking the door behind him. Kalari emerged from the tunnel an hour later, her children trailing behind. "They're gone," John said, leaning heavily against the workbench. Kalari's eyes searched his face carefully. "You risked everything for us." John exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, I guess I'm getting used to the company." Kalari smiled softly, stepping closer. "You are more than just company, John," she said. "You are part of our bond now. And for that, we are grateful." John glanced at the children, who watched him with wide, trusting eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something stir deep within him, a sense of belonging he thought he had lost long ago. "They'll be back," John said, his voice low. "And next time, they won't stop at searching." Kaleri nodded. "Then we will face them together." John met her gaze, and for the first time since this all began, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance.